Kia ora and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first meeting of the Climate Change and Sustainability Committee for 2023. Before we get underway, just the emergency procedures will be placed on the screens. If the members of the public, staff and committee members can just have a quick read, make sure that you're safe. In the event of an emergency, we will be following officers' direction, so please remain calm and we'll take action as needed. We're now going to move on to our opening karakia. Will be on the screen shortly. Do feel free to join in as well. Me noi tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kinekina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. Moving on to our apologies. We have apologies today from Councillor Edwards. Happy to move those. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Parkin. All in favour say aye. Declare that carried. We're now moving on to public comment. We've got a couple of people down on the list. First up, we've got Marley Mellish. Apologies that everyone else is here to support Marley. Please grab a seat. Marley will be talking on the update of Council's climate change work. You have 3 minutes. Once you're finished speaking, there may be some questions from members, so please feel free to remain in your seat. You can find the button there and your mic will turn green. Over to you.
Thank you, Josh. So climate change is now absolutely self-evident. The news in the last 2.5 weeks shows. I believe the Hutt Valley is particularly vulnerable as the whole East Coast. The Hutt River originates in our very high mountains, the Tararuas. The hills on both sides are over 1,000 feet, and we're very vulnerable. So we could be filled wall to wall with silt. The authorities, there's been a lot on the news about putting the sponge city principle into urban development, and I believe the Hutt Valley is ideal as the sponge city potential. Yet Upper Hutt wants to put residential subdivisions right into the Waiponga swamp. That's Upper Hutt. But we are ignoring the basic principles that really need to be watched. So sponge city mechanisms include rain gardens, converting stormwater pipes to streams, and in my particular interest, building rescue mounds, of which I have some examples in this presentation I prepared for the Otato Nahiri conference at the end of October. If and when we get a wall-to-wall flood, such rescue mounds could be a place to combine demolition timber, ruined vehicles, and silt into very local, you don't have to take it to the tip, plant it full of trees, and the trees themselves attract the biodiversity, the fungi, the insects and things that will take care of such pollution. I want to speak with your planners for TTLH Transition Town to you get 2 copies. You get these 2 in here. Those, and I'll have, so you can have 1 for the councillors and 1 for your planners, and I'll keep a 3rd. That's my poster, which I'm distributing 2 copies of.
Thank you, Marley. Is there any questions from members? Councillor Mitchell.
Yeah, just this concept of the mounds that you were talking about, that provides some kind of refuge for people when the floods, and can you give any examples of cities around the world that have adopted these? Thank you.
Japan has done a lot of this. I've been totally unable to get Japanese material on how they work, but they have done hundreds of tiny forests, some of which are in the form of tsunami rescue things. And when you have a flood like in the East Coast, you can put all of your contaminated stuff right nearby. They're typically 5 meters high. They're planted with a tree, a native tree, 3 per square meter. And as a result, the roots interlock, the branches interlock, and these mounds have survived tsunamis.
I could perhaps just add a little bit, Molly, if
Please,
you like. There was
Pam.
an example from Christchurch just earlier this week
Yes.
where a new open space area for people, for multi-purpose, has just been opened, and it's built on consolidated waste from the earthquake. You may have heard it on the news. I couldn't find it online before I came. And of course, you've got the rain gardens that Auckland City Council are implementing, amongst other things. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's more innovative thinking, really, isn't it?
Any final questions from members? Deputy Mayor Lawes.
Thank you, Molly and Pam, for coming in and presenting these ideas. It's always good when the public are doing lots of research. In this paper today, we're discussing investment for carbon reduction.
Yes.
And a fund to accelerate the reduction of it. And biodiversity is something that I'm, keen on in our bush and things like that. Are you aware of the condition of our hills for slips and things?
Do I what? I live in York Bay, and we have been watching the loss of understory because of the deer. And by the way, Joe Goodman, is it? The ranger has ensured that there is better deer control, and I have myself seen a great advantage. I work planting the Waiu swamp with native trees. This poster has pictures of our early plantings, which were munted by the deer. I've gone back to the same plantings, and they have regrown. So deer control is essential. But the rescue forests, if we build tiny forests right inside the city, preferably in the poorest subdivisions, these are places the deer won't come. And these true tiny forests, true Miyawaki forests, would very soon become reservoirs where you could collect eco-sourced native seeds and would be available for spreading throughout. So my vision is for volunteer activity to be greatly expanded, let's say funded by your fund. And I know just how much it costs to build a native plant nursery because I work in the Wainuiomata nursery. And it is affordable to build one. And it is a very mental health giving thing to do nursery work.
Thank you, Marlene. We have one final question from Councillor Parkin.
Kia ora. Thank you for the idea. It's fascinating. Just a point of clarification, and that is these mounds, I'm hearing you, I'm getting the impression, because you're talking about Japan post-recovery, that it's actually a way of dealing with flood material that has been after a disaster. And so how do you see that working with a currently...
Before a disaster.
Before a disaster, because it seems like you're talking about an after-disaster recovery method.
Well, the Japanese ones were built some after, but most of them before. The way it's done is to dig out 1 meter deep from an area preferably paved the size of a tennis court. Mix that soil 50-50 with what would in this country be mulch from native trees. 50-50 dug out soil, including rubble, 50-50 with native trees, make a little bit of a mound, plant 3 trees per square meter, weed it for 2 to 3 years, and walk away. They are absolutely self-maintaining because everything interlocks. And this is a genius of the Japanese botanist who has only recently been discovered by European and more recently American people.
Thank you, Molly. Also, thank you, Pam and James, for coming in. What I'll do when we get to the report, I'll ask officers to make any comments from their perspective. But also, on the way up, please make sure you do pass your contact details on to the officers sitting.
Make sure I do what?
Pass on your contact details onto the staff sitting behind you to
Okay.
further the conversation if you wish later on as well.
So I've given 2 copies, but I want to keep it in this envelope because that has the most important of the references. A reference to this presentation and a reference to the very useful reference to the Japanese implementation.
Thank you very much. And we've got copies now for members going around the table, but thank you for coming in. We
Thank you,
really
Josh.
appreciate your views you've expressed today.
Been a big pleasure.
Members, we're now moving on to agenda item 4, conflicts of interest. Does anyone have a conflict to declare? Fantastic. We're now moving on to the first substantial paper of the meeting. I'll welcome up Chris Page, Climate and Sustainability Advisor, to the table. So members, we're on page 9 for the Low Carbon Acceleration Fund for Lower Hutt. Chris, do take the paper as read. I'm sure there'll be questions from members, so happy to open the floor up. Questions? Councillor Brown?
Thank you. I've got a question about the intention of putting subsidies in for businesses. My question is that the best use of the limited funds we have targeting businesses, or would we be better to target the whole population with behaviour change or, don't want to get into a situation. No, I'll stop. Thank you.
I guess there's different pieces of work there. We are doing work, alternative work on behaviour change and messaging that will be coming through soon. In terms of supporting businesses, it's from what we've heard from our business community and through the development of the Climate Action Pathway and the Carbon Reduction Plan, that businesses need that support to create that step change and showcase carbon reduction actions. And that'll help to create momentum within that wider community of showcasing action that can be done and is achievable.
Councillor Brown?
So just to follow up on that, how will we know that this is not going to be funding initiatives they were doing anyway?
So it will ensure that they have to have a certain amount of investment in the initiative themselves. So I think the paper proposes a 50% contribution for them and 50% within the fund. And it does require them to be undertaking the action that would, I guess, create that bigger reduction above what their business as usual process would be.
So if I may, I think Councillor Brown's question is trying to get to the point of if a business, an organisation was already going to undertake their decarbonisation, then kind of why would we be in kind of co-funding them to do it if it was already occurring? So how would officers ensure that we'll be co-funding new initiatives that would otherwise not occur?
It would be I believe it would be part of through the assessment process of the assessing your application would look at, I guess, what their existing or planned process would be.
Councillor Mitchell?
Thank you for the paper. one of the many things linked to in there is our own carbon reduction and resilience plan of 2021, action point 19, which talked about the development of this fund. And back then when that was written, it explained that this could be used for things including accelerating reforestation of Belmont Regional Park, achieving step changes in pest management, and improving carbon sequestration efforts throughout Lower Hutt. I just wondered if you could speak a bit more to why our thinking has changed from there to not include the kind of sequestration and biodiversity efforts.
So the prioritisation of emissions reduction is based around the fact that we've got 7 years to reach our 50% emissions reduction target. And there's still a lot of work to do, particularly in the community space to help enable that. And so it requires us kind of working alongside the community to provide that support and overcome those barriers that exist, particularly in the earlier stage before that wider kind of momentum and cost benefit is more widely socialised. It's proposed that this will be the focus initially because of that pressing timeframe to reach that 50% emissions reduction, and that over time we would kind of transition towards including more of those biodiversity incentives as well.
And this might not be a question for you, it might be a question for Andrea, sorry, but the initiative we heard about in public comment to take some, by the sound of it, public land and put a forest on it, if that's not included in this particular fund, do we have any other funding mechanism to support that kind of activity currently?
Not that I can think of directly. I mean, it's possible that it could come from other community funds, depending on what the outcomes were, but nothing particularly around that kind of resilience.
Deputy Mayor Lawes.
Thank you, and thank you, Chris. The paper's got a lot in it, and from a public perception, me just being like new to the game, say, trying to understand and get my head around what is going on here. We hear about climate change. We know the effects are happening, we're seeing them now. But the paper has a lot in it, and then for me going back and looking at all the links that were included, I see there was, right in 2020, we were going to do half and half for biodiversity and for carbon reduction, but this paper doesn't seem to mention anything about biodiversity. And yeah, my concern is why isn't it included in the paper as where it's going to go, an amount put to it as well? Yeah, that's probably my first question.
I guess kind of referring back to the reasoning behind prioritising the emissions reduction work, and the paper discusses the shift to increasing the emphasis on biodiversity over time, to really, I guess, focus on those timeframes that we're having to face to achieve that emissions reduction target. In terms of a lot of that biodiversity aspect, the funding that comes from the carbon credits is relatively limited, and that's why the emphasis is around kind of capital expenditure rather than an operational expense, because it's not going to be ongoing and self-sustaining as well. That's about kind of creating a step change.
Also, with the Reserves Act, it does say that the funds that, if it's generated from the bush and things like that, is meant to go back into the forest and be cared for. And we just seem to be going all to the carbon reduction, not put it into biodiversity. So why do we get to that point?
So it is identified in the paper that normally under Section 80 of the Reserves Act, it would, income generated from reserve would go back into the reserve. There is precedent already through Greater Wellington's Low Carbon Acceleration Fund, where they do a similar thing that's all internally focused. And also noting the impact that carbon emissions have on climate change that ultimately feeds back and impacts on biodiversity itself.
Any further questions from members? Councillor Parkin.
Would it be practical to have a criteria where items that have the same amount of carbon emission reduction but also have the advantage of biodiversity are actually prioritised?
That could be an option that could be explored. I guess the intent behind this paper was to focus on providing our business community and not-for-profits an opportunity to undertake emissions reduction works. In terms of the focus being on them, I'm not sure to what extent some of the initiatives that they might undertake would have a secondary biodiversity co-benefit, but that's something that could be explored.
Final question at all? No? In that case, thank you, Chris, for answering those questions today. What I'm going to do, I'm sure there'll be some discussion. I'm going to move the recommendations as noted in the report, 1 to 5, and open the floor. Is there any seconder? Sorry. Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. Any debate? Councillor Mitchell, followed by Deputy Mayor Lewis, then Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I am happy to support the recommendations, Chair, in part because this is at last demonstrating some action that we really need to see. And I'm sure we'll achieve some really good things in our city and for modelling some good stuff in our city too. I do kind of share a concern I'm hearing around the table about the lack of funding into biodiversity through this fund. You know, there's an old saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the second best time is today, but we're still with this fund talking about doing it later. And, you know, Climate Change Commission's advice to our government included policy direction to incentivise planting of new native forests. And just a quote from their text, Aotearoa will need to start now to grow new native forests so that carbon removals can be used to offset our carbon gas emissions from 2050. So the question for me is, if not through this fund, then how we fund that biodiversity stuff. So that's maybe something we look at through our Indigenous biodiversity strategy or some other means, but it seems to be a bit of a gap, for me at least, at the moment. The only other thing I wanted to comment on was the assessment criteria, and there's some good criteria there. I think part of how we use this money is how we bring about the behaviour change and what influence we can have on our public as well. So I don't know if that could also be an assessment criteria, but I kind of think about different projects and how they might have a different reach into our communities and different levels of public benefit or public influence that people see behaviour modelled in a way. You know, it's, as I mentioned to Councillor Briggs earlier, it's very different for a business to put an EV charger out the back for the use of their staff, or to charge the business vehicles, from putting it out the front where everybody sees it and everybody has access and can use it, and kind of normalises that behaviour as well. So I don't know if that could also be considered as an assessment criteria, but I do understand this is all coming back to us later on, so I just wanted to put it on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. Deputy Mayor Lewis.
Thank you. Yes, it is a good paper. There's so much in it, as I said. I do have some concerns, and it is around the biodiversity. I sat through the biodiversity group, and it was very clear that there was support needed for education, for working with the community and things like that. So if that's in this paper, if there is a fund there to do all of that and to work with mana whenua who were very strong on protecting the environment and reinstating, you know, bush and things like that, I'd be supportive, but I'm a bit concerned that the public might see us putting money that, into businesses, whereas perhaps it could be widespread into the community. We might get a better result, but happy to learn more about, you know, what the officers think is the best bang for buck.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Brown.
Thank you. I'm supporting the paper, but I'm concerned about the subsidies for businesses. We've done that before with developer remissions, and it's always hard to know whether it's going to happen anyway. And when we're at rock bottom, cutting back everything, particularly in our basic services, and we're hazarding a chance that this is encouraging it. This is new business, not current. So really keen to see how you manage that criteria and how you'll work that out. And I'm, plenty of other things to see it, but we have, I mean, look, I acknowledge we've got those targets that we need to reach. I'm not of the same opinion as Councillor Lewis, so I think it was a really clunky report. It was hard to read, and climate change is complicated, but the report just ramps it up, makes it that just a little bit more complicated. So I think a lot of people who are working in the climate change space are probably facing this, but it's high time we start articulating climate change to general Joe Blow, or else it's just going to stay up in the like this report almost is, stay up in the airspace and not land. So, yeah, thank you.
Is there any councillor wishing to speak against the motion? No, in closing then, from my perspective, I think the points that have been raised are fair, particularly around Councillor Mitchell, around the reach of any project that we would be co-funding, and ensuring that it's going to actually influence behavioural change, I think is key. As been pointed out, we've got very limited funding in council, so we need to ensure that whatever we are funding doesn't only have a significant decarbonisation for our cities impact, but that behavioural piece to start getting momentum, whether it's in the business sector, the community sector, and in our schools, so that everyone's taking action. Because if we don't have everyone taking action, we will not reach our city's goals of decarbonising. With that being said, I'm going to put the recommendation. All in favour say aye. Those opposed, I declare that carried. Thank you, Chris. Now moving on to agenda item 6, update on council solid waste and waste minimisation work. Andred, please come up to the table. As you all know, Andred's our Senior Advisor of Waste Minimisation. So we're now on page 19, members. Andred, welcome. Do take the report as read. If there's anything new that you wish to update us on since the time of it being written, please let us know now. Otherwise, we'll take questions. Thank you. Open the floor to members for questions. Councillor Shaw.
Thank you for the paper. Just a question, we've talked about it often in the past. I'm just a little bit interested to see if this conversation has progressed, and that's around food waste. So you make reference to it on item or number 13 on page 21. So can you give us a little bit of an update on how that conversation might have progressed since then?
Thank you. Yes, I can. Ourselves, Wellington City Council and Porirua City Council officers are all working collaboratively on an organics business case to address the problem of to develop a region-wide organics collection and processing facility. So at the moment, we are proactively working on this business case with our consultant, Tonkin and Taylor. And we are just in the process of establishing a long list of options. So organics is a very complex field with with new technologies constantly emerging, as well as sort of the more sort of standard ones. So right now it's a process of seeing what's out there, identifying what is sort of particular to all our areas, and trying to work out what sort of options are best applicable.
And also just noting, we've got a paper on food waste business case coming to us in July. I presume there'd be a workshop with all council before that case as well.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Councillor Mitchell?
Just on that note, though, and hopefully not preempting what's coming to us in July, but I was just curious because you mentioned a region-wide solution, but currently our council, Wellington and Porirua, which are the three biggest councils in the region, are looking at it together. But whatever we do, will it be of a scale that we can fold in Kapiti or Upper Hutt if they wanted to kind of join in as well, or the government makes them do it eventually?
So Kapiti and Upper Hutt have expressed an interest in the mahi that we are currently doing. So there is provision to take on that extra capacity if required. But we're also, we are also going to make sure that there's additional capacity for the likes of maybe other regions too, such as the Wairarapa and Horowhenua, should they wish to come on board.
Any further questions? No, thank you, Andrew. I'm now going to move the recommendation on page 19 that the committee notes the update on the various solid waste management and minimisation matters. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Parkin. All in favour? Any debate? No? All in favour say aye. Those opposed? I declare that carried. Thank you. We're now moving on to page 25 for the update on Council's climate change work. Jonathan, please come up to the table. Jonathan is our energy and carbon advisor. And so again, Jonathan, we've had some public comment earlier today. If you can respond to that, and do welcome up any of your colleagues or Alison or Andrea as well, if you want to add any more response.
Yeah, so I think the public comment today was around two things. The first was around rewilding, which I think we should put to the parks team. And the second comment was around climate adaptation, which we note in the paper that the detailed impact assessment will be complete mid this year, where we can start planning how to adapt off that assessment.
And also, any comment from the directors? No, thank you. Just going down now, obviously we've got a recommendation in this paper alongside the update of not continuing exploration of flaring gas at the closed Wainumata landfill. Is there any more detail you want to add that's not in the report to that matter? Thank you. Questions from members? Councillor Brown.
Thank you for the update about the flares. If it's not going ahead, what will be the actions for that site going forward, if any?
So in terms of emissions, those will reduce naturally. We have had discussions about what we could do with the site. One idea we have at this stage, which we haven't received quotes back yet on, is installing solar PV onto that space, because we can't do much else with that land. So that's one idea we have at this stage, but no detailed plans yet.
Further questions, Councillor Mitchell?
Just to follow up on that idea, so basically making a bit of a solar farm, and would that electricity be for use of council and council facilities, or would it just be exported to the grid there?
No, that would need to be exported to the grid. We do have a wastewater station nearby, but I don't know yet.
Other questions on the totality of the report as well? No? In that case, thank you again, Jonathan, for fielding questions today. I'm going to move the recommendations on page 25. One, that we note the update on various climate change work streams, and 2 agrees that officers do not proceed with further work on the flaring gas at the closed Wainuiomata landfill. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. Is there any debate? A few comments from myself, particularly on the exploration that we did do at the Wainuiomata landfill. In discussions with officers, obviously it was, a bit challenging to find out that it wasn't going to be viable, but also just thanking officers for the work that was done. If we hadn't done testing, and we would have potentially have over-invested in the landfill and not got a return on it, and it wouldn't have been the best use of ratepayers' money. So thank you for doing that work, so we can make a good decision today to be able to look at other options potentially that aren't flaring. Any final comment? In that case, I put the recommendations. All in favour say aye. Those opposed, I declare that carried. We're now moving on to the 6-month biodiversity update for deer culling. Andrea will be fielding questions for this paper. Is there anything that you wish to add, Andrea, or take it as read?
I'm happy to take the paper as read. Kelly Crandall, our Head of Parks and Reserves, is meant to be here. I think she's just, for some reason, been held up, and she may well join. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those I can, and others we could take away.
Thank you. Questions from members? Councillor Mitchell.
Thanks to the officers for the report, and really interesting to see the numbers in there, which are pretty frightening, really, the number of animals that are being culled on quite a small area of land. My question though, Andrea, and there's some talk in there again about how we're currently developing an Indigenous biodiversity strategy that will look how we kind of deal with this in the future, but I'm really just interested in the next 12 months. What's our intention for the next 12 months, given that last year we did something a bit out of the ordinary by funding 2 culls instead of just 1?
So my understanding is that we intend to continue with what we did last year, so to do 2 culls again, and then a reassessment of that would be done in line with the biodiversity strategy.
Further questions? Councillor Shaw.
Our earlier speaker, Molly Melch, referred to the amount of damage being done on the eastern hills of above her place in York Bay. And I was a bit surprised to not see that as a priority area, or even on the map showing culling. So is that, how do we determine whether that area gets, gets some attention in those 2 culls?
Usually those culls are informed by resident sightings, and so if that, we can check on that, but if that hasn't come through earlier, we certainly can pass that information on and make sure that it is.
Councillor Mitchell.
Maybe if I could just add to that too, I understand that the Regional Council look after much of the area around the bays there. The East Harbour Regional Park is Regional Council land, not ours, and that's why it's not reported through here, but certainly they're doing the same kind of work through the park there and allowing balloted recreational hunting as well.
Yeah, and just continuing, I was at the Eastbourne Community Board meeting, I think end of last year, where there's an update from the Ranger, and they're being very proactive, but also acknowledging that red deer are impacting all of our forests around the city. Deputy Mayor Lewis.
Thank you, Andrea. In the financial considerations, the funding for the deer culling is from the operations budget. Do you know off the top of your head how much that is? Is it written in somewhere?
I can't answer that one off the top of my head. I'm just looking, I don't think it is noted in the paper, but I think the budget, that's actually the budget line, is insufficient for 2 culls, which is what we're looking to do. So I think budget considerations for this certainly have to be part of the Indigenous biodiversity strategy, but also there was an increased amount approved in the recent annual plan LTP committee for next year's work to cover 2 culls. I just can't remember what the amount was. I can come back to you with that.
Final questions? No, in that case, I'm going to put the recommendation on page 30 that we note and receive the report. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Shaw. Any debate? Councillor Mitchell?
Yeah, just briefly to acknowledge the extra work that was done last year, and we can see by the figures that it was really necessary, and you can still see that in our forest too with the understory. So it feels like we're making a start on something that we still kind of don't really understand, as expressed in the paper as well, the scale of this issue. But certainly very happy to see this response, because we did have a lot of people coming in through public comment in the last triennium and contacting me as well directly. So I'm really glad to see that we made that extra investment last year, and that it has been worthwhile, and that we can continue with that in the foreseeable future.
Councillor Parkin?
I just wanted to again thank officers for the work that's been done, but also note that the Greater Wellington Regional Council officers trialling the thermal drone management, I think, could be a critical part of our planning information, and thoroughly look forward to seeing what the results of that are, as to whether or not we can utilise it as a tool to actually track how we're doing, whether or not we are reducing the numbers as stated as needed in the plan, and whether or not we actually need more investment in there.
Similar to Councillor Mitchell, it's good to have these reports. I know last triennium they weren't on the work plan originally, but having them being highlighted to members, as well as the additional funding, has made a difference. It's also set a good template as well for future reporting once the biodiversity strategy has been developed, because obviously this is only one part of a really complex piece that we need to be taking care of in council. So thank you to the officers for the preparation of this report. I'm going to put the recommendations. All in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed? I declare that carried. We're now moving on to page 36 for the Climate Change Sustainability Committee Forward Programme. I'll speak to this briefly. So there's a number of papers in the future cycles for this year on page 38. There will be more added as well. I've had early discussions with officers about the totality of the work plan, and also noting a conversation earlier with Councillor Mitchell before the meeting around having the group that's making sure Te Arawhakamoa, our climate pathway for our city, is being reported on specifically. It's often just kind of a footnote amongst the wider climate change update. So we'll add that to the work plan as well, to ensure that we're hearing from them directly, those members, and what impact they're having in our city. Is there any other agenda or, items that people are wanting to see in the next 12 months that aren't currently on the work plan? Deputy Mayor Lewis.
Thank you. Our speaker mentioned spongy cities, and I don't know if it's this committee, I think it would be, but the Whaitua had suggestions for progress into our district plan on policies around things like spongy cities. Could we get an update of where that's at, please?
It's been noted. Anything further? Councillor Parkin.
Just a query on the appropriateness of the business case for solar photovoltaics on council facilities. Is it worth folding in the suggestion of solar on the landfill and utilising that area as part of the same assessment, so we can compare the two?
The business case has been developed for our rooftops, so I think using the current scope as it is appropriate. If there's any further direction following that, then we can look at that.
Okay, just to note that there is a large financial difference between the cost of installing solar on a roof versus installing solar on ground level facilities. So it might be that it's worth noting that earlier, but.
Yeah, happy to have that conversation offline. I've had initial conversations with officers, which I can provide you more detail on then. Wonderful. So if anything else does come up, or members do think we need to enhance our work plan, do let me know. I'm happy to take suggestions throughout the term. So now I'm going to put the recommendation that we note the forward programme as attached as Appendix 1. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. All in favour say aye. Those opposed, I declare that carried. Now, just before we, questions, I've received no questions. But before we go to our final karakia, just wanting to acknowledge a couple of our staff members, knowing this will be their last committee meeting with us. So Jonathan and Chris, thank you very much for your contributions to council, particularly our decarbonisation work. It's much appreciated. I'm sure when you're going to your next organisations, you'll be well treasured as you have been here. So thank you so much for the work that you've done. And now we're going to ask officers to put up the closing karakia. Please feel free to join in. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia e te urutapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairoa I te arataka tū. Ko ia rā e rongo, whakahiria ake ki runga, kia wātea, kia wātea. Ai rā, ko wātea. Hau, pai marere. Thank you, everybody. I now close the meeting at 2:45.